They say some doors don't open unless you're the right kind of person, and on a cold morning in a town most maps forgot. Daniel Carter wasn't looking for any door at all, just a place to rest his bones and maybe find a little quiet. His old pickup coughed to a stop beside a narrow street lined with shuttered shops, paint peeling, windows dim, the kind of place where time didn't pass so much as settle like dust. And beside him, Rex lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes fixed on a single storefront as if he'd heard something no one else could. The bell above the door rang once, soft and clear, though no one had touched it, and Daniel felt that old instinct stir in his chest, the one that had kept him alive in places far louder than this silence. He stepped inside anyway, boots creaking against worn wooden planks, the air thick with the scent of old paper, cedar oil, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. Like a memory the building hadn't let go, behind the counter stood Harold Whitman, thin as a winter branch, eyes pale but sharp, watching Daniel not with surprise, but with something closer to recognition, as if he'd been expecting someone, though he couldn't quite remember who. "You're late," the old man said quietly, voice dry as the dust that coated the shelves, and Daniel almost smiled, because he'd heard that before, in places where time mattered too much, but here it felt different, softer, like a line from a story no one had finished. Rex moved past him, without a sound, nose low, tracing the edges of the room until he stopped near the back corner, one paw lifting slightly, hovering over the floor as if he could feel something beneath it, something steady, something waiting. Daniel noticed, of course he did, because Rex didn't do anything without reason, and whatever had drawn them here wasn't just shelter from the wind. The shop was failing, that much was clear, shelves half empty, light bulbs flickering, the quiet too heavy for a place meant for people. And yet Daniel found himself staying, fixing a loose hinge, wiping down glass, doing the kind of small work that didn't ask for anything in return. Days passed without announcement, marked only by the slow rhythm of sunlight shifting across the floorboards, and each night, just as the world outside went still, there came a sound, faint at first, then undeniable, a soft, deliberate knock from beneath the wood, spaced evenly like a heartbeat buried deep below. Rex heard it first, always, ears rising before the sound reached Daniel, eyes turning toward that same corner, waiting, listening, as if something down there was calling in a language older than words. Daniel would stand there in the dim light, hand resting on the counter, counting the seconds between each knock without knowing why, feeling that quiet pressure build, not fear, not quite, but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize the past isn't finished with you yet. And one night, as the wind outside fell completely still and the bell above the door gave a single, gentle chime on its own, Rex pressed his paw firmly against the floor and looked back at Daniel, not with curiosity, but with certainty, as if to say, "This is it, this is where it begins." The sound did not stop after that night. It returned with the same quiet persistence, every 27 seconds, a soft knock rising through the floorboards like something breathing beneath the shop, and Daniel Carter found himself counting again without meaning to, his mind slipping into the old rhythm he once used to measure time in places where listening meant everything. Rex never left that corner now, lying with his head low and ears sharp, watching the wood as if it might answer him at any moment. And even during the day, when sunlight crept through the dusty windows and the town outside moved in slow, tired patterns, the dog would pause mid-step and tilt his head, listening to something deeper than sound. Harold Whitman noticed it too, though he never spoke of it at first, only watching the dog with a strange, distant expression, as if a memory was trying to surface but could not quite reach the light. Daniel kept working, repairing shelves, rewiring an old lamp, sealing cracks that let the cold air in, small acts that slowly brought life back into the shop. And with each passing day, the place felt less abandoned, as if it had been waiting not just to be fixed, but to be remembered. One evening, as the sky turned a pale amber and the shadows stretched long across the floor, Daniel found an old photograph tucked behind a stack of ledgers, the paper brittle with age, showing a younger Harold standing beside three men in uniforms that did not match any branch Daniel recognized, their expressions serious, their eyes fixed not on the camera, but somewhere beyond it. There was a symbol pinned to their jackets, a simple mark, etched like a compass that had lost its direction, and when Daniel brought it to the counter, Harold's hands trembled ever so slightly as he took it, his gaze lingering on the image as though it carried more weight than the years had been able to bury. Some things were never meant to be found again, the old man said softly, not as a warning, but as a confession, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier, until the knock came again beneath their feet, steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Rex stood immediately, a low sound building in his chest, not fear, but recognition, and he stepped closer to the exact same spot, placing his paw firmly against the wood as if answering the call. Daniel moved without hesitation, crouching down, running his fingers along the floor until he felt it, a slight give beneath the grain, a seam too precise to be natural, and when he pressed down, the sound changed, hollow, waiting. Harold turned away then, walking slowly toward the window, his shoulders heavy with something unspoken, and in the fading light, he whispered, almost to himself, "It has been quiet for a long time, longer than it should have been." And Daniel understood then that whatever lay beneath them was not just hidden, it had been kept, protected, and perhaps even forgotten on purpose, until now, until the moment someone stayed long enough to listen. Daniel did not open the floor that night, not yet, because something in the air suggested that whatever waited beneath them had already waited longer than either of them could understand, and rushing it would feel like breaking a silence that deserved respect. Instead, he covered the seam again, carefully, almost gently, as if tucking it back into place, and Rex watched him without protest, though his ears remained alert, tracking that steady rhythm that never truly faded. Harold Whitman said very little after that, but the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Daniel found him sitting behind the counter with a small wooden box placed in front of him, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, the edges darkened like it had been held through countless quiet moments. "If you are going to listen," the old man said, his voice slower now, measured like each word carried weight, "then you should hear all of it." And when he opened the box, the faint scent of aged paper and metal rose into the air, carrying with it something older than the shop itself. Inside were folded documents, yellowed maps, and a thin metal key unlike any Daniel had seen before, its surface engraved with that same symbol from the photograph. The compass without direction. Rex moved closer, nose twitching, but he did not touch anything, only watched, as if he understood that this was not something to disturb lightly. Harold lifted one of the papers with careful hands and unfolded it across the counter, revealing lines and markings that did not resemble ordinary maps, but something more deliberate, more concealed, like a guide meant only for those who already knew what to look for. This place was not always just a shop, he continued, his eyes distant now, reflecting something far beyond the walls around them. And what is beneath it was never meant to be forgotten, only hidden until the right moment came. And Daniel felt that quiet shift again, the one that told him he had stepped into something larger than chance. Outside, the town moved slowly, unaware, the sound of a passing truck echoing faintly down the street. But inside, time seemed to narrow, focusing on the space between the counter and the floor where the knocking continued, steady as ever, like a signal, waiting to be answered. Daniel picked up the key, feeling its unexpected weight settle into his palm, colder than the room around him, and for a moment, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding that once a door like this was opened, nothing would return to the way it had been. Rex let out a low, steady breath, then stepped back toward the corner, placing himself exactly where the seam lay hidden beneath the wood, his posture calm now, certain, as if the waiting was over. Harold closed the box slowly, his hands resting on it for a moment longer than necessary, and when he looked up, there was no doubt left in his expression, only a quiet resolve that had taken years to form. "It does not answer to force," he said softly, "only to those who choose to stay." And Daniel nodded, because he understood that better than most, understood what it meant to remain when leaving would be easier, to listen when silence felt safer. And as the next knock rose through the floor, clear and steady, he set the key down beside the seam and reached for the edge of the wood, knowing that whatever waited beneath had finally decided it was time to be found. The wood did not resist him the way he expected. It shifted with a quiet ease, as if whatever lay beneath had already decided to let go. And as Daniel lifted the panel free, a breath of cold air rose from the darkness below, carrying with it the scent of stone, metal, and something older, something untouched by the years above. Rex stepped forward immediately, not rushing, not afraid, but deliberate, his body low, ears forward, every movement measured like he was following a path he had always known was there. Harold Whitman did not move from his place behind the counter, but his eyes followed them, steady and calm, as if this moment was not a surprise, but a long-awaited conclusion. Beneath the floor, a narrow stairway revealed itself, carved into solid ground, each step worn smooth, not by time alone, but by purpose, and Daniel paused at the edge, feeling that familiar pull between caution and instinct, the same balance he had learned to trust years ago, when listening mattered more than seeing. The knocking had stopped now, replaced by a silence so complete it felt intentional, like the space itself was holding its breath. Daniel reached down, picking up the engraved key, its cold surface grounding him, and without a word, he began to descend, one step at a time, the wood above closing softly behind him as if sealing the world away. The air grew cooler with each step, the light fading until only a thin line remained above, and then even that disappeared, leaving only the faint glow of a single bulb at the bottom, its light steady, unwavering, as though it had never gone out. Rex moved ahead of him, paws silent against the stone, stopping just before a heavy metal door set into the wall, its surface marked with the same symbol that had followed them from the photograph to the key, a compass that pointed nowhere and everywhere at once. Daniel stood there for a long moment, not reaching for the handle, not yet, because something about the door felt less like a barrier and more like a threshold, the kind that did not just open a space, but a truth. Behind him, far above, the shop remained still, the world unchanged, unaware, and yet here, beneath it, everything felt different, as if time itself had folded inward, waiting for this exact moment to unfold. Rex turned his head slightly, looking back at Daniel with a quiet certainty, his amber eyes steady, and then he placed his paw gently against the base of the door, not pushing, just resting there, as if confirming what they both already knew. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound echoing softly in the enclosed space, and he raised the key, aligning it with the lock that had not been touched in decades, his hand steady, his mind clear in a way it had not been in years, and as the metal met metal with a soft, deliberate click, he understood that whatever waited on the other side had not been lost, only waiting for someone who would not turn away, someone who would stay long enough to listen, and finally, to open it. The lock did not resist the way Daniel expected. It turned with a slow, deliberate motion, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. And when the door finally opened, it did not reveal darkness, but a quiet room preserved in time, untouched by decay, untouched by neglect, as though the years above had never reached this place. A soft, steady light filled the space, not harsh, not artificial, but calm, like something designed to endure rather than impress. And Rex stepped inside first, his movements careful, respectful, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the air, which carried no dust, no rot, only the faint scent of aged paper and cold metal. Daniel followed, his boots echoing lightly against the smooth stone floor, and as his eyes adjusted, the details began to emerge, rows of shelves lined with carefully arranged documents, sealed containers marked with dates that stretched back decades, and at the center of the room, a large wooden table, its surface cleared except for a single file bound in dark leather. Nothing felt abandoned here, nothing felt forgotten. Instead it felt intentional, as if everything had been placed with purpose and left exactly as it needed to be until someone came to understand it. Daniel moved closer to the table, his hand hovering just above the leather file before he finally touched it. The material cool beneath his fingers, and when he opened it, the silence around him seemed to deepen, like the room itself was listening. Inside were pages filled with precise handwriting, diagrams, and records that did not match any ordinary archive, each line documenting events that had never been spoken of, decisions that had shaped outcomes no one questioned because no one knew they had been guided. Rex circled the room slowly, stopping at intervals as if checking each corner, his presence steady, grounding. And when he returned to Daniel's side, he sat without command, eyes fixed on the open pages as though he too understood that what they were seeing mattered in ways words could not fully explain. Daniel turned another page, then another, the weight of what he was reading settling into him not as shock, but as a quiet realization, the kind that grows slowly, piece by piece, until it becomes undeniable. This was not just a hidden archive. It was a record of truth carefully kept out of reach, not to hide it forever, but to protect it until the right moment, until the right person, above them. The world continued as it always had, unaware of what lay beneath, unaware of the story that had been waiting in silence. And for a moment, Daniel felt the full weight of that contrast, the simplicity of the life he had been living against the depth of what now rested in his hands. He closed the file gently, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, understanding that this was only the beginning, that whatever had been entrusted to this place was not meant to be taken lightly. And as he stood there in the stillness, with Rex beside him and the quiet room stretching out in every direction, he realized something he had not felt in a long time, not since before the years had hardened him, a sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not by chance, not by accident, but because he had stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Daniel did not rush back upstairs right away. Instead, he stood there in the quiet room, letting the weight of it settle, the kind of weight that did not press down on the body but on the understanding. And as he opened the file again, more slowly this time, he began to see the pattern beneath the pages, a structure to the truth that had been carefully arranged, not chaotic, not hidden in panic, but organized with intention, as if someone had believed this would one day be read by the right eyes. The documents spoke of decisions made in silence, agreements reached outside the view of history, moments where the direction of entire events had been quietly shifted, not for power, not for gain, but for something more difficult to define, something closer to preservation than control. Rex moved further into the room, stopping near a row of sealed containers, his nose hovering just inches away without touching, as though he understood boundaries that had never been spoken. And when he turned back toward Daniel, his expression was calm, grounded, the way it had been in moments when everything depended on reading what could not be seen. Daniel walked along the shelves, his fingers brushing lightly across the labels, each one marked with dates, locations, and names that stirred something faint in his memory, fragments of stories he had heard in passing, headlines that never quite made sense, pieces of a larger picture that now began to connect in quiet, undeniable ways. He paused at one container, slightly worn at the edges, and lifted it carefully, feeling its unexpected heaviness. And when he opened it, he found a collection of smaller notebooks, each filled with precise entries, observations written in a steady hand that did not waver, even when the events described carried a gravity that most would not have been able to hold. Above, the faint sound of the shop settling reached him, the soft creak of wood adjusting to the day, and it reminded him that the world outside remained unchanged, unaware of what lay beneath its feet, unaware that history itself had a second layer, one that had been kept not to deceive, but to wait. He closed the container and returned it to its place, understanding that this was not something to take, not something to remove, but something to learn from, something that required patience and respect. When he finally turned back toward the door, Rex was already there, sitting quietly, watching him, as if asking not what they would do next, but whether he was ready to carry what he had seen. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that felt deeper than the room itself, and he nodded, not to the dog, not to the space, but to the understanding that had settled within him, that this place had not been waiting for discovery, it had been waiting for stewardship. And as they made their way back toward the stairs, the light above faint but steady, he knew that nothing in his life before this moment had been wasted, that every mile, every silence, every choice to stay when leaving would have been easier had led him here, not to uncover something hidden, but to become part of something that had been quietly shaping the world all along. When Daniel and Rex stepped back into the shop, the light felt different, not brighter, not dimmer, but heavier, as if the air itself carried the knowledge of what lay beneath. And Harold Whitman was still standing where they had left him, his posture unchanged, his eyes steady, as though he had been listening not for footsteps, but for something deeper, something only silence could reveal. Daniel did not speak right away, because there were no simple words for what he had seen, no easy way to place it into the small space of conversation, and instead he placed the key gently on the counter, its metal surface catching the faint afternoon light, and for a moment, the three of them stood there, bound not by explanation, but by understanding. Rex moved to his usual spot near the corner, lying down with a quiet certainty. His ears relaxed now, as if the signal that had guided him here had finally settled into stillness. Harold stepped forward slowly, his hand hovering just above the key before, resting beside it, not touching, only acknowledging its presence. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a softness that had not been there before. "It is quieter now, is it not?" And Daniel nodded, because he had felt it too, the absence of that steady knock, replaced by something deeper, a kind of peace that did not erase the past, but allowed it to rest. The old man turned his gaze toward the shelves, the worn wood, the fading photographs, and for the first time, Daniel saw not just a shop owner, but a man who had carried something far beyond his years, something that had shaped his life in ways no one around him could have understood. "I was never meant to keep it forever," Harold continued, his eyes distant, reflecting a time long before Daniel had arrived. Only long enough. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not as an ending, but as a passing of something unseen. Daniel leaned against the counter, his hand resting flat against the surface, grounding himself in the simple reality of wood and space. Even as his thoughts reached deeper, connecting the fragments he had begun to understand below, and he realized that what had been hidden was not just information, but responsibility, something that did not belong to any one person, but still required someone to carry it forward. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its tires humming against the pavement. The sound ordinary, familiar, almost distant, and it reminded him that the world beyond this place continued without pause. Unaware that anything had changed, Rex lifted his head briefly at the sound, then lowered it again, calm, present, as if he had already accepted what Daniel was still learning to hold. Harold moved behind the counter and opened the register, not to take money, but to remove a small folded paper tucked beneath it, its edges worn, its surface marked by time, and he placed it beside the key, his movements careful, deliberate, as though each action carried meaning beyond itself. "There are things written there that I never showed anyone," he said quietly, "not because I did not trust them, but because it was not their time." And Daniel understood then that this moment was not just about discovery. It was about timing, about the quiet alignment of choices and patience that had brought them here. He reached for the paper, unfolding it slowly, aware that each layer revealed was not just information, but a step further into something that could not be undone. And as he read the first lines, he felt that same steady clarity return, the one that had guided him through silence before, the one that told him without doubt that he had not come here by accident, that staying had been the only path that would have led him to this place, to this moment, and to whatever came next. The paper felt thinner than Daniel expected, almost fragile, as though it had been folded and unfolded too many times by hands that carried more hesitation than certainty. And as he smoothed it gently against the counter, the faint creases caught the light, like quiet lines of memory waiting to be read. The handwriting was steady but aged, each letter deliberate, each word placed with care, not rushed, not hidden, but written as if the writer knew it would one day be found by someone who would understand its weight. Rex remained still near the corner, his breathing slow and even, his presence grounding the room in a way Daniel had come to rely on, while Harold stood quietly across from him, not watching the paper, but watching Daniel, as though the meaning of what was written mattered less than how it was received. The first line spoke not of events, but of intention, a simple explanation that what had been kept beneath the shop was never meant to rewrite the past, but to preserve a version of it that had been set aside, not out of deception, but out of necessity, because sometimes truth required patience before it could be understood without causing harm. Daniel read slowly, letting each sentence settle before moving to the next, and as the meaning unfolded, he began to see how the records below connected not just to history, but to moments of decision, quiet intersections where outcomes could have shifted in ways the world would never have recognized. And yet someone had chosen to guide them gently, without recognition, without reward. Harold moved slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the counter. And when he spoke, his voice carried a softness shaped by years of holding something he could never fully share. "There were others before me," he said, not as a boast, but as a continuation, and each one stayed only as long as they needed to. And Daniel understood that this place had never belonged to any one person. It had simply passed through them, shaped by their choices, defined by their willingness to remain when leaving would have been easier. Outside, the light had begun to fade, the sky shifting into a muted gray that softened the edges of the buildings across the street, and inside, the shop seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, as if the day itself was pausing to listen. Daniel reached the final lines of the paper and paused, his eyes resting on a sentence that did not instruct, did not command, but simply acknowledged that the truth below was not something to reveal all at once, but something to carry carefully, to understand fully before choosing what to do with it. He folded the paper again, slower this time, aligning the edges as though the act itself required respect, and when he placed it back beside the key, he did not feel uncertainty, only a quiet clarity that had been building since the moment Rex first stopped at the door. Harold nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried a sense of completion, as if a chapter long held open had finally found its place. Rex lifted his head and looked toward Daniel, his eyes steady, calm, no longer searching, and in that silence, Daniel realized that the knocking had not just stopped beneath the floor, it had shifted, no longer a call to be answered, but a presence to be carried forward, and for the first time, he did not feel like someone who had found something hidden, but someone who had been entrusted with something that had chosen him in return. That night settled differently over the town, quieter than before, as if something unseen had shifted beneath the surface and the world, though unaware, had adjusted to it in subtle ways, and inside the shop, the air carried a stillness that no longer felt heavy, but grounded, like a place that had finally said what it needed to say. Daniel did not return below immediately. Instead, he sat near the counter with the folded paper and the key resting in front of him, his fingers tracing the edges. Absent-mindedly, not searching for answers, but letting the understanding come at its own pace. Rex lay nearby, stretched out but alert in his own quiet way, his breathing slow and steady, no longer reacting to distant signals, because whatever had called them before had found its way into silence. Harold Whitman moved through the shop with measured steps, adjusting small things that did not need adjusting, a habit born from years of filling time while carrying something too large to speak about. And when he finally sat across from Daniel, there was a softness in his posture, a lightness that had not been there before. "It becomes clearer with time," he said gently, not looking at the paper, but at Daniel, as though the words were meant to reach something deeper than thought. "Not all at once, and not in the way you expect." And Daniel nodded, because he could already feel that truth unfolding, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow alignment, pieces settling into place without force. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections across the windows, and the faint hum of electricity blended with the quiet of the evening. Ordinary sounds that now seemed almost distant compared to the silence that had once lived beneath their feet. Daniel picked up the key again, weighing it in his palm, feeling not just its physical presence, but what it represented, not access, not control, but trust, something given without guarantee, something that required choice rather than obligation. He looked toward the corner where the floor had been opened earlier, now sealed again. The seam nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and he understood that the space below did not demand attention. It simply remained, waiting to be returned to when the time was right. Rex lifted his head slightly, following Daniel's gaze, then settled again, calm and certain, as if to remind him that not every answer needed to be chased, that some were meant to come in their own time. Harold reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn watch, its glass scratched, its hands still moving with quiet persistence. and he placed it beside the key, not as an offering, but as a continuation, something passed along without ceremony. "It belonged to the man before me," he said softly, "and to the one before him." And Daniel realized then that what he had stepped into was not just a hidden truth, but a quiet lineage, a chain of people who had chosen to carry something forward without recognition, without certainty of where it would lead. He closed his hand around the key and the watch, not gripping them tightly, but holding them with a steady, deliberate care, and in that moment, he felt something settle within him, not a decision made out of obligation, but one that had been forming long before he arrived, shaped by every moment he had chosen to stay, to listen, to act without expecting anything in return. And as the night deepened outside and the shop grew still, Daniel understood that the story beneath the floor was not waiting to be revealed, but to be continued, quietly, carefully, by someone willing to carry it without needing to be seen. Morning came slowly, not with brightness, but with a quiet gray light that filtered through the shop windows and settled gently over the shelves, the counter, the worn floor that now held more than just years of footsteps. And Daniel Carter woke in the chair where he had sat through most of the night, the key and the watch still resting in his hand, not gripped tightly, but held as if they had become part of the rhythm of his breathing. Rex was already awake, sitting near the door, ears forward, watching the empty street with a calm alertness that spoke not of danger, but of awareness, the kind that never truly rested. And when Daniel stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders, the dog turned his head slightly, acknowledging him without needing movement. Harold Whitman was not behind the counter, and for a moment, the absence felt louder than any sound. But then Daniel noticed the back room door slightly open, a thin line of light cutting across the floor, and he walked toward it slowly, not with urgency, but with a quiet understanding that something had shifted during the night. Inside, Harold sat in a simple chair by the window, the morning light resting across his face, softening the lines that time had carved there. And for the first time since Daniel had met him, the old man looked at ease, not burdened, not distant, but present in a way that felt complete. "You heard it, did you not?" Harold said without turning, his voice calm, almost gentle, and Daniel paused, thinking of the silence below, the absence of the steady knocking that had once filled the space, and he nodded, because what he had heard was not a sound, but the lack of one, a stillness that carried its own meaning. Harold smiled faintly, not with relief, but with acceptance, as if the ending of one thing had always been the beginning of another, and he gestured toward the small table beside him, where a folded cloth lay carefully placed, something beneath it creating a slight rise. Daniel stepped closer and lifted the cloth, revealing a set of old keys, more than he expected, each one different, each one marked with subtle engravings that echoed the symbol he had seen before, variations of the same compass, each pointing in its own silent direction. "There are other places," Harold said quietly, "not many, and not meant to be found easily." And the words did not feel like a warning, but a continuation, a path that extended beyond the shop, beyond the town, into something wider than Daniel had imagined. Rex moved closer, his nose hovering near the keys, not touching, just acknowledging their presence, and Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle. Deeper, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that does not demand action, but invites it. Outside, the town began to stir, a distant engine starting, a door closing somewhere down the street, the ordinary world returning to its quiet routines, unaware that beneath its surface, something had changed, something had been passed on. Daniel covered the keys again with the cloth, not hiding them, but preserving their place. And when he looked back at Harold, he saw not a man holding on to the past, but one who had already let it go, who had carried what he needed to carry and was now ready to set it down. "You stayed," Harold said simply, his eyes meeting Daniel's with a steady calm. "That is all it ever required." And in that moment, Daniel understood that everything that had brought him here, every mile, every silence, every choice to remain when leaving would have been easier, had not been leading him to an answer, but to a responsibility, one that did not ask for recognition, only for someone willing to continue what had been quietly carried for longer than history itself would ever remember. The rest of that morning passed with a quiet rhythm. the kind that did not rush forward but unfolded gently, as if each moment understood it was part of something larger. And Daniel Carter found himself moving through the shop with a steadiness he had not felt in years, adjusting shelves, straightening items, bringing small order to a place that had carried so much unseen weight. Rex followed him at a distance, never far, his presence calm and certain, no longer searching, only observing, as if the need to guide had softened into something quieter, something more enduring. Harold Whitman remained by the window for most of the morning, watching the light shift across the street, his hands resting loosely in his lap, no longer occupied with holding on to anything. And when Daniel brought him a cup of coffee, the old man accepted it with a nod, his eyes warm in a way that felt new. "It feels different," Harold said after a long silence, not looking at Daniel, but at the world outside, and Daniel understood that he did not mean the shop, but something deeper, something that had settled within both of them. The hours moved slowly, marked by the soft creak of wood, the distant hum of passing cars, and the quiet presence of two lives that had, by chance or by something more deliberate, come together at exactly the right time. By midday, the light had grown stronger, casting long patterns across the floor, and Harold finally stood, moving with care but without hesitation, as though a decision had already been made long before this day began. He walked to the counter, placing both hands against its worn surface, and looked at Daniel with a clarity that carried no doubt, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that had taken years to form. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice steady, and he reached beneath the counter, retrieving a small envelope, its edges worn, its seal unbroken, and he placed it in front of Daniel with a deliberate care that spoke of its importance. Daniel did not open it immediately, because something in the moment suggested that this was not about urgency, but about understanding, and instead he looked at Harold, waiting, listening in the way he had learned to do, without pressing, without assuming. Rex stepped closer, his nose lifting slightly toward the envelope, then settling again, as if confirming its presence without needing to disturb it. Harold exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry years with it, and he nodded once, not as permission, but as acknowledgement, and Daniel finally reached for the envelope, feeling its weight, lighter than he expected, yet carrying something that felt far heavier. He broke the seal carefully, unfolding the paper inside, and as his eyes moved across the lines, he felt that same quiet clarity return, stronger now, more defined, not as a question, but as an answer that had been waiting for him long before he ever stepped into the shop. Outside, the town continued as it always had, unaware, unchanged, and yet within the small space between the counter and the door, something had shifted again, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that would endure, quietly, steadily, carried forward by someone who had not come looking for it, but had stayed long enough to receive it. Daniel read the contents of the letter slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because each line seemed to carry a weight that asked to be understood rather than rushed, and as the meaning settled, he realized this was not just a continuation of what he had already seen below, but something more personal, something that connected the quiet history of that hidden room to the life of the man standing before him. The letter spoke of choice, not duty, making it clear that nothing had ever required Harold to stay, that every year he remained had been his own decision, guided not by obligation, but by a belief that some truths needed guardians rather than witnesses. It described moments when he had considered walking away, leaving the shop behind, letting the hidden room become just another forgotten space. But each time, something had called him back, not a voice, not a sound, but a feeling that what he held was not meant to end with him. Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lifting to meet Harold's. And in that quiet exchange, there was no need for explanation, because the letter had already said what needed to be said. Rex shifted closer, his presence steady, grounding the moment in something real and immediate, and Daniel reached down briefly, resting his hand against the dog's shoulder, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than words could hold. Harold took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with a calm that came not from certainty, but from acceptance, and he nodded once, as if acknowledging that the final step had already been taken. "It is yours now," he said softly, not as a transfer of ownership, but as a recognition of something that had already happened, something that had been set in motion long before either of them fully understood it. Daniel looked back at the letter, at the final lines that spoke not of instructions, but of trust, a trust placed not in knowledge or skill, but in the simple act of staying, of listening, of choosing to remain when leaving would have been easier. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to soften, casting a warm glow across the street, and the world continued as it always had. Unaware that within the quiet walls of that shop, something had been passed from one life to another, Daniel folded the letter carefully, aligning its edges with the same care he had shown before, and placed it beside the key and the watch, not separating them, but letting them rest together, as parts of a story that could no longer be divided. Rex lay down again near the corner, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, not asleep, but at peace, as if whatever had once stirred beneath. The floor had finally come to rest. Harold stepped back slightly, his hand brushing against the counter one last time, and there was a stillness in him now that felt complete, not empty, but finished in the way a long journey comes to its natural end. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, feeling the quiet settle around him, not as silence, but as something fuller, something that held both what had been and what would come next. And in that moment, he understood that nothing had been taken from Harold, only given forward, carried on not by force, but by choice, the same choice that had brought him to the door, the same choice that had made him stay, and now, the same choice that would guide whatever came after. The evening arrived without announcement, settling over the town in soft layers of fading light, and inside the shop, Daniel Carter stood near the window where Harold Whitman had spent so many quiet hours, watching the world pass by without ever knowing what had been kept beneath its feet. Rex lay close by, his steady presence a quiet anchor in the stillness, his ears relaxed, his breathing slow, as if he too understood that something had reached its natural end and something else had quietly begun. Harold sat in his chair once more, but there was a difference now, not in his posture, but in the absence of something that had once been there, a weight no longer carried, a silence no longer guarded. And when he looked at Daniel, there was no question left in his eyes, only a calm that came from knowing he had done what he needed to do. The shop itself felt different, not because anything had changed on the surface. The shelves still worn, the floor still marked by years of footsteps, but because the meaning of the place had shifted, no longer just a store, no longer just a quiet corner of a forgotten town, but something deeper, something that held a story that would continue long after the world outside moved on. Daniel picked up the key, the watch, and the folded letter, holding them together for a moment before placing them carefully in the drawer beneath the counter, not hidden, but kept exactly where they needed to be. And as he closed the drawer, the sound was soft, final in a way that did not end anything, but marked the beginning of something new. Rex stood and moved toward the door, pausing briefly to look back, his amber eyes steady, as if asking a question that did not need words, and Daniel followed. Stepping outside into the cool evening air, the sky stretched wide above him, fading into deep blue, the first stars beginning to appear. The street was quiet, the same as it had been when he first arrived, and yet it no longer felt empty, because now he knew what lay beneath, what had always been there, waiting not to be found, but to be carried forward. Behind him, inside the shop, Harold remained by the window, his silhouette still against the soft light, a figure at rest after a long and quiet journey, and Daniel understood without needing to turn back that this was the last time things would be exactly as they had been. He rested his hand briefly on Rex's back, feeling the warmth, the steady presence that had led him here without ever needing to explain why. And together they stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking, just allowing the stillness to settle around them. Then, with a quiet breath, Daniel turned back toward the door, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged, stepping inside once more with a calm that came not from certainty, but from acceptance. And as the bell above the door gave a single, soft chime, he understood that some stories do not end when they are discovered. They continue in the hands of those who are willing to stay, to listen, and to carry them forward without needing to be seen, because perhaps the world remembers truth in its own time. And it always finds its way back through those who choose kindness when no one is watching.